Have you ever lost your voice? I'm not talking about laryngitis here or the after effects of a particularly raucous karaoke night. I'm talking about that shrinking feeling when you lose all sense of who you are, your confidence, your way in the world. Well, I have, my friend. I think it's been a cocktail of a few things over the years. An exhausting, but not exhaustive combo of the shifting sands of identity, early motherhood, the ravaging of the beast that is perimenopause, social anxiety, masking, burnout, and let's not even mention the pandemic. I have become obsessed with this whole idea of finding your voice and what it means creatively, personally, and collectively when we find it. I want to understand how you find it, and if you've lost it, how do you get it back? Join me as I talk to fascinating people who have found their voices and aren't afraid to use them. People who have found their purpose, their passion, and fearless, authentic expression. I'm talking about writers, activists, artists, thinkers, entrepreneurs. We're going to get into their work and their life stories. How did they do it? What were the turning points? What barriers did they overcome? How did they find the courage? And what tips and tricks do they have to navigate this business of becoming? I'm looking to reclaim my voice, yes, and to get my mojo back, but it's more than that. I want to understand this topic and look at it from all angles: historical, cultural, societal, biological, mythical, even mystical. And most of all, through a female lens. Let's not beat about the bush, it's mostly women I'll be speaking to, with the occasional brilliant man thrown in. But these conversations are for anyone who resonates with the quest. Everybody's welcome. Hi, my name is Jessie. I'm a writer by trade, a novelist by aspiration. I do not have the answers, not yet. I'm not a certified coach with patented life theories or a high-flying CEO with productivity hacks. I am no guru, but what I am is endlessly curious about other people and their stories. I've programmed and run a literary and storytelling event series for over a decade now, so I know firsthand the power that stories have to inspire and transform, and that's what we're here for. So, if you want to find your voice or to be inspired, if you're in a liminal state, a similar boat, if you just really like books or want to feast on the sweeping stories of amazing people's life and work, then this podcast might be for you. Please follow, subscribe, and join me on this voyage into voice. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find ours along the way. In today's episode, I'm speaking to the brilliant writer Lily Dunn about her latest book, Into Being, which explores the radical craft of memoir. I think memoir is pretty radical when done right. There's a lot of vulnerability and courage involved in sharing your story. Lily came to speak at one of my events last year, and I was really struck by her bravery. I think it was the first time she told her story on stage, and it was electric. She had just published her astonishing memoir, Sins of My Father, which tells the story of her father, who left their family to join a sex cult when Lily was very young. In it, Lily takes an unflinching look at how his addiction and narcissism fractured family dynamics and impacted her life. It's beautifully crafted and devastating. We talk about finding your voice as narrator, what memoir brings to the writer, as well as touching on themes of sexual abuse and grooming, so please take care if these subjects could be a trigger for you. I found it really fascinating, having read Sins of My Father, to have Lily's process demystified and Into Being, and to see just how long the process is. I started by asking her the role of an editor in shaping the story.
I mean, I think editors are essential in whatever you're writing, because they exactly that they sort of mirror what, they help pick out the things that you don't always see. And I think when you're writing memoir, that's even more potentially problematic or, challenging, because often, we're writing about our own lives, aren't we? And we're writing about our own sort of psychological makeup and the way that we see the world. And that is so utterly ingrained in who we are. And we're moving through life as this sort of modelled, kind of sculpted human being that has come out of our parents and their parents and, generations of people within the family. And when you start to stand apart from that and start to write it and interrogate it, which is what you're doing when you're writing a memoir, that process is a really kind of difficult process of kind of detaching yourself from who you are, really, and being able to see it as story, see it viewed through a reader's mind, see it as its sort of archetypes or themes, or all of those things that you need to bring out in a book that works. And I mean, I compare it in Into Being a little bit like the sort of relationship you have with a therapist, because a therapist is there to help you articulate and understand the experience that you've gone through in order to overcome it in some way. If it's been a negative experience or it's affected your behavior or your relationships. And I think writing memoir is quite similar, because you need to be able to see yourself as a character, as a character kind of acting out a particular aspect of a life. So there's a sort of performative element to it. So I think what I discovered in my own process was that these relationships with trusted mentors were really essential. Just for, I mean, it can simply just be someone guiding you and holding your hand and encouraging you and saying, actually, you can do this. You have the means to write well and to create a compelling story. And I certainly needed that, I think, at various stages, because the other thing with memoir that's different from fiction is that your voice as the narrator, you are the main character for a start. So you have to characterize yourself, but you also need to, actually Marina Benjamin has a really nice term for it. She says it's sort of leaning into the narrative. It's you as the narrator need to find your voice in order to tell the story in a compelling way. And part of that is having an opinion about things, and thinking that people are actually interested in what your opinion is. Mm-hmm. So that for me was a definite kind of about building in confidence, I think, and building in authority to feel that actually what I felt about my life and the people in my life mattered, and that my reader wanted to learn from me. That was a very particular process that I had to go through.
What was that process? How did you move from sort of, I wouldn't say feeling voiceless. So I as I have read your books, I think you did feel voiceless a lot, and kind of your needs were subsumed to your father's. So it was writing the Sins of My Father was a whole kind of exercise in finding your voice. But how did you grasp that sort of confidence? How did you find that authority within yourself?
I think for me, it probably was a combination of it being part of the process of committing to the book over that period of time. So, and because I was doing a doctorate, I was studying for a PhD at the time, I was doing a lot of reading around my subject, and I was interested, the subject of addiction and narcissism and cults and all the things that go into Sins of My Father just started to kind of grow and blossom naturally in my reading, and in my research. Not so much. It wasn't just for the book; it was also for the PhD. It was for the critical essay. So I think the more I immersed myself in that world, and I had a genuine interest in learning about it, and my genuine interest in learning and reading was fueling my own understanding of myself and how I had been affected by this. I just sort of grew in confidence that I knew what I was talking about, I suppose, because I was started to get backed up by other people's theories and realized that it wasn't just me, this was actually a thing that lots of people, children of narcissistic personality parents, or parents who had been addicts to various things, had also experienced very much the sort of 70s generation. I connected with other children of cult members who had joined this sannyasin cult that my father was involved with. All of it just started to kind of give me that platform, I suppose, where I just felt actually, I really am onto something here, and this is an important book. But I think the real tipping point for me was just going back to this mentoring and actually to Marina Benjamin. It was when she read that final draft, because I wrote, because it started as a series of essays, and then I sort of mashed up the essays, and because I wanted to find a timeline through the book. And so I did a second draft, which was chronological, but I lost that slight critical edge that the essays had. And then in the final draft, when I asked Marina to help me, it was her saying to me, "You need to lean into the narrative," and it was like a penny dropped, and I was like, "Okay, this is the difference between just writing scenes like you do when you write a novel, where you're always told you need to do lots of showing and not telling, and writing narrative nonfiction, which is where you've got much more of a balance between showing and telling. And the telling actually is really a really important part of the storytelling, because it's you as narrator's reflective voice, finding meaning in the past. You look at those scenarios that you were in, um, which you might be exploring through fiction, and you're reflecting on them as an adult, and you're finding meaning. You're finding the points of illumination. And I think that was the moment when I realized, actually, this is a really well, I realized lots of things. I realized it's a really exciting way of writing, because all that hard work that you do through your life, when you want to overcome something, and it does often involve therapy, when you've had difficult experiences as a child. I could put that to good use through the book, because actually I did have that wisdom. I did have good sort of mature thoughts about particularly with all that reading I'd done. I actually had something really interesting to share with the world. And I think I just hadn't really given myself permission that I could do that. So Marina helped me realize, that I could do that. And that was great. And then somehow when that clicked, that final draft just worked. It's like it just came alive. The whole book fell into place.
So the final draft was that kind of dual perspective that you described of kind of you're very good, I have to say. You're a brilliant writer at sort of evoking the sort of feelings for you or your father, whoever it is at the time, but then also that sort of perspective from above to make meaning out of it. So that's the layer that you said, leaning into the narrative. That's what it means to you.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And it felt really important, as you say, with this book, because it was about me being voiceless as a child and a teenager and 20s, and choosing, my in the relationships that sort of just re-emphasized that, that I was sort of always slightly squashed by the people in my life because of the pattern from my past and my father being such a dominant influence on me. So it felt like the book became my chance to speak. Simply, it was my story. It was my chance to speak. It was my chance to present this story from my perspective. And that felt so important. And I think that's where memoir is really strong, and it's often people with similar experiences to mine in various different scenarios. But, that's why they're often drawn to memoir, because they haven't had the chance to really be heard.
Do you think memoir sort of is an act of empowerment then? Do you think it is? Or you say it's about an overcoming. Do you think it's also about, like you say, having your voice heard, and about taking power, taking control of your story?
Yeah, I do. I really do. And I think most of the memoirs that I really have enjoyed have had an element of that in them. There are a lot of memoirs that sort of, they have that very sort of dynamic quality of discovery, that the writer is on a crusade almost, like, to get to the truth of something that has not felt right. It's like, they have not accepted the myth of what they've been told about this part of their life. I mean, the one that comes to mind is Richard Beard's The Day That Went Missing, which I use a lot in my teaching, because it is a literal investigative detective story about Richard getting to the truth of a really important part of his past, where he knew that he was in the water in the sea in Cornwall when his brother died, that he was with him when he was 11, his brother was 9. But his family had been thrown into this such extreme denial about the incident of his brother drowning that they had not acknowledged this. And he was a writer of fiction, and his brother kept on appearing in his fiction as a kind of disguised character. And still his parents didn't acknowledge that actually, what Richard was trying to express was this truth, of his memory of his childhood. And so he realized that actually the only way that he could confront this denial was to write it in nonfiction and write it as a memoir. And The Day That Went Missing is basically his amassing the evidence. So, he goes and talks to all the people, like the Coast Guards from that back from that time, and the friends who had visited, and his mother, and he has all these sort of series of interviews, and then he returns to the place in Cornwall. So it has so much power because it potentially changes not just yourself, but also those people who you're close to, and whether they want that or not is another thing. But,
It's a very courageous act.
yeah.
That's what all of the examples that you use in Into Being, it really struck me, and also the courage and the bravery that you approached Sins of My Father with as well. There's there's a radical honesty.
Mm.
I wonder, how Richard, the writer you just described, how does he feel about that process? Do you think it's a universal feeling of kind of a transformation through sort of delving into these dark, pressing questions from your life? Do you think it's always about transformation for the writer?
Well, I mean, I think it is, but that's because I that was my experience, and from the writers who I spoke to for the book for Into Being, it was very much their experience. But I think to different degrees. Some people, I mean, I see that as a wholly positive thing, despite it also being very challenging, and difficult. Richard talks about it. I interview him in the book, and he talks about how difficult it was for his mother to be confronted in this way. But what I really admired in him was that he very much saw himself as a writer, as in, I am a professional writer and this is my job. It's not just the emotional journey of this, but it is also that I have committed to writing this book, and this is what I take very seriously. And I think a lot of people, and unfortunately a lot of women, because women find it difficult to stand by their relationship with writing as a vocation, as something that is really important and essential beyond everything else. I mean, obviously, within that there is all the sensitivities of your personal relationships that you have to absolutely take seriously and honor. But I admired the way that Richard, even though it was challenging for his mother and his family, he saw it as an essentially important project for him to undertake. And as I say in my book, in our interviews, he did find it much more profoundly transforming than writing his story in fiction. I think some people find writing memoir, it's transformative, but it's just too difficult, that perhaps they don't come out feeling that they are, that they're somehow sort of cleansed of this burdensome sort of emotional turmoil or whatever it is that has pushed them to the page. So I suppose it's the cost, isn't it? It's are you willing to go through the challenges to get to the other side? Some people perhaps don't want to do that, and I can absolutely understand that.
It's a painful thing. And I wonder if maybe the difference between the writers that find transformation and those that don't are whether the former are able to really investigate sort of fearlessly and find that sort of dual perspective that you talk about, rather because you make a distinction in Into Being between that and then just what memoir isn't is just, a series of events without kind of really fully understanding it. You said something interesting there about how, on the whole, women find it harder to take their writing seriously. Could you expand a little bit on that and how that's shown up in your life?
Well, I just think, I mean, I know it is a fact because most of the people who come on my courses and who I mentor are women, and probably the biggest obstacle for them for writing their memoirs is their fear of how it's going to hurt family members, which, I completely understand. And it is a very important thing to consider. And it's a valid fear. There's a wonderful book written by Alyssa Altman, who is an American author, called Permission, which isn't currently published in the UK, but you can get it on audiobook. And it's all about that. It's all about giving yourself permission to write the story that you feel compelled to write, despite the fear that you have.
How do you do it? What's the answer?
Well, I think you do it by accepting that that you can't please everyone all the time. And I think this is just such a female characteristic. It's just the way we're born and bred. And particularly if I like to say particularly if we're mothers, but I don't think that's even true. I think we just are.
We're conditioned.
We're conditioned, exactly. And so it feels very alien to put our needs, what appears to be our needs, above those of people that we love. And and that does have to be really seriously considered. We have to take responsibility, I feel, for potentially hurting people who don't want to have aspects of their personal life out there for other people to read, in a public sphere. And why would they? If they're not writers, why would they? How could they even understand that you would want to do that? So there is always that risk. So I suppose, I don't want to use the word ruthless, but I think that there has to be an edge of kind of, maybe it's courage that you will do it despite the consequences. But then within that field, you have to also be sure of why you're doing it. So
The purpose element, the why.
yeah, and I think it really helps. I mean, it inevitably helps if your book is bigger than the story itself. Like if you know that your book is going to change lives in some fundamental way, that you're adding to a conversation, that it's important beyond just your own single story.
Did you find that in writing Sins of My Father? Because obviously it is a very universal story. It is a personal exploration. But I understand that you have had so many people reach out to you who kind of had similar experiences with that specific cult, the Osho cult, and just kind of wider sort of cult 1970s scene. Were you aware of when you were, and also so many other themes, narcissism, addiction. Were you aware of how kind of universal and important your story was when you were writing it?
I wasn't. I absolutely wasn't fully aware of it at the beginning. Although I knew that there was what became named as the dirty little secret, which within the community, which was that there was a lot of sexual abuse of young children and teenagers within this group that my dad was involved with. And I mean, I knew it personally because it had happened to me when I was a teenager and I was groomed. Well, I mean, as a child, I got unwanted attention from men in the communes when I visited my dad. And then
Was this in Oregon when that happened? I'm just trying to, because it sounds like when you were living in London, it sounds like there were kind of acolytes sort of this cult, or kind of there was a community, shall we say, but then also there was Oregon, which was established after India. Maybe it was as well. Could you just explain very briefly what the cult was?
Yeah, my dad left us as a family in 1978 or 9 and joined what they were called the sannyasins. The Rajneeshis was another word for them, and they were a group of devotees to his name at the time was Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, and he had an ashram in India, in Pune. He later became Osho, and that's how he's known now, even though he's not alive anymore. So my dad left when I was 6, and he sort of disappeared and went to Pune for 6 months. And then when he came back, he went and lived in a place called Medina, which was down in Suffolk. And I spent my weekends at Medina with him when I was, sort of 7 or 8. It was there that I got kind of unwanted attention. Then when the group got too big for the ashram in Pune, they all moved to Oregon. And there's a documentary which was very successful on Netflix called Wild Wild Country that people might have seen. And that's about the time. Well, it's about the ashram in Pune as well, but it's mostly about Oregon. So I never visited Pune or Oregon. My dad lived in Pune for a bit, on and off, and he visited Oregon, but he never lived there. But he established his own commune in Italy, because he was a businessman and he ran a publishing company, and he lived in this beautiful big villa in Tuscany, and people came and lived and worked with him there, and they were all sannyasins. So I spent my summers and some winters with my father in his house as a teenager. And it's there that I was groomed by one of his friends when I was 13. And it had a profound effect on me. I think mostly because I was so in need of my dad's attention, and he just was very absent. And it was part of his personality, but also part of the kind of whole sort of, idea of parenting, which was to basically be very hands-off. And I missed him. I loved him. He was very charismatic. And so this man who was his friend sort of, absolutely sort of tapped into that emotional energy and that need in me, and kind of made me become very dependent on him. But I sort of went through life. I mean, this affected me profoundly because I then sort of, chose boyfriends who were way too old for me. And, I always got into that pattern of being very kind of unequal in a power dynamic, in my relationships as a result of.
Do you think that was from the grooming from this man, or do you think that was a kind of the father wound?
I think it was the father wound and the grooming. I think the grooming definitely, it definitely left its mark. I mean, that was a kind of foundational experience for me emotionally, even though I didn't, thankfully I didn't have sex with him. But the emotional effects lasted. And I think I also just always felt different because I'd had this very sort of different experience with my father growing up. And so I wasn't very good at just being like all my friends and, just doing normal kind of kid stuff. And my dad...
Yeah, you describe it as being sort of exposed to kind of adult complexity, and also kind of heightened sexuality, even though you weren't sort of partaking in that before was the right time, shall we say?
Yeah,
and the effect that had on sort of how do you navigate your teenage years through that?
Yeah, so there was a bit of me sort of feeling a bit superior, I suppose, and I was a bit more grown up than everyone else, and which was absolute tosh. It was a sort of protective thing, I guess. But so, yeah, in terms of, sorry, just going back to your original question, I had the privilege of being raised by a wonderful mother in North London and going to a
Love your mum.
normal school. Yeah, my mum's brilliant.
She's amazing. We have to talk about her as well.
Yeah. And going to a normal school. And so I knew that this grooming incident in Italy was not right. I just knew in my bones it was not right, even though there was no kind of protection around me. Like my father was not going to step in and protect me. And actually, he actively encouraged it. So I always, growing up, I always had a hunch that this can't have been an isolated event. It must have been something that was a norm within that community. So when I came to write about it many years later, I did have this real kind of itch that I wanted to try and expose that, because it had affected me. When Wild Wild Country came out, there was no mention of the kids. There was no mention of the sexual abuse. And I just knew that it was not, that this was kind of quite a normal thing. I mean, how could it not be in a sex cult? So part of me writing about it was trying to explore that. And the first essay the first piece I put out there was about it was an essay I did for Granta, which was about my own personal experience with this man. And then I wrote a second piece, which was about what it was like for me growing up, as the child of someone who had become a sannyasin, and that was published by Eon. And it was that piece that was called The Lost Children. And it was that piece that I got lots of feedback from people who were my age, who had grown up in the communes, and they started to write to me and say, "Oh, thank you so much for writing this, because no one else will talk about it." And so I realized at that point that this dirty little secret actually was something that was being very
It's a big secret.
controlled. It was a big secret. So it was interesting that through the writing and through sending those pieces out into the world, I started to realize actually that this was a story that needed to be told. And that also gave me the confidence to have these other voices coming back and saying, thank you. I wish that, I'd been able to write this myself, that actually as a writer, I should take that seriously and I should really pursue this, which is...
It's like it's feedback, isn't it? And it kind of makes me think of, the question you touch on in Into Being. Kind of some people say, okay, great, so write a memoir, but like you don't need to publish it. But I suppose that perhaps, do you think that reveals the importance of getting the word out there as well?
Well, it really does. And I mean, the other thing that happens when you work on a book for as long as I worked on Sins of My Father is that, you have invested so much time and energy into this book that actually, if, not to publish it, if you are given the opportunity, it would be like
Mad.
Self-sacrifice. It would be mad.
How long did it take you?
Well,
how long was the process?
It probably took about 4 years, I guess, maybe a bit longer, but on and off, because I was writing those essays and then I'd return to it, and and I was working and doing all sorts of other things. So yeah, it took quite a long time. But yeah, I mean, just going back to that thing of kind of why publish it. I mean, this Sins of My Father led to a documentary, because me and my friend Marusha, who did grow up in the communes, we developed and pitched a documentary in answer to Wild Wild Country. So it was about the young people's experience growing up in the communes, and that Marusha made, and ITV picked it up and she made it, and it got shortlisted for or longlisted, I think, for the BAFTAs. So it's done amazingly well, and it's also got those stories out there. So I'm not saying that my book, that wouldn't have happened without my book, but my book certainly added to the conversation, and it got that rolling. It helped with that development.
Yeah, absolutely. You're so vulnerable in some ways, aren't you, when you're kind of speaking your truth, but also you're so powerful at the same time. You're kind of, what does it feel like to have a memoir like that out, or all of this information? How do you feel about being seen in that way, having that level of visibility?
Yeah, I mean, I get asked this question a lot, and I think this is also part of the power of memoir, which I write about in Into Being, that through the process of writing and researching and crafting your work, it's a process of separation. It's a process of detachment, because the more you sit with something and the more you create story from it, the more you craft it into something beautiful and aesthetic and something like a gift, you can give it to the world. It becomes an artwork, doesn't it? It becomes something separate from you. So I had funny scenarios recently, because I started running with my dog recently, and have made a new bunch of friends, who are my dog running friends, and they very little about my life, and apart from, it's a bit like having new kind of baby friends. It's like you bond around your dogs, and slowly they've all been reading my memoir. And it's
Wow.
really bizarre, because it's kind of like, they sort of say, but this happened to you, and this, and and how do you feel about us knowing about this? And I'm like, well, I feel fine about it, because it happened years ago, and I wrote a book about it, and now it's out in the world, and I don't really identify with it anymore, and it's a story. I mean, yes, it's my life, but it's a story. And so that's been quite an interesting kind of process to see actually quite how far from it I've come. That it's not weird. It really helped to have those essays out initially, because that those were the difficult points, was putting those essays out into the world, like before anyone knew about this stuff. And I think you can build up a whole load of vulnerability about exposure and, oh my God, what are people going to think of me, and etc. And then you realize actually that people don't judge you, and they don't, it's not, it's unusual, but it's not that unusual. And actually it becomes an act of generosity. It becomes an act of sharing. It becomes a way to help other people access difficult things in themselves. So, the positive response is far greater than the negative.
Yeah, you kind of touch on that in Into Being. I feel like perhaps memoirists are sometimes charged with being sort of self-obsessed, for example, but I do think it's the complete opposite, because it is the kind of finding the universal in the deeply personal.
Yeah.
And then it is an act of generosity, because so you can understand so much about your own life. I was just thinking about the kind of section in Sins of My Father about kind of, I don't know if this is correct, but I see it as your kind of not sort of lost 20s, but that period of time in your 20s, when I think it was at your 20s, when you're having like strings of sort of slightly toxic relationships and inappropriate boyfriends, and you're trying to find yourself, and friendship problems. I mean, it's so relatable. Just even that like little nugget.
Going out clubbing.
So yeah, I do think it's an act of generosity. So can we talk about yes, the sort of effect on family, and also your brilliant mum? How has the process of writing Sins of My Father, how has that kind of like affected your family dynamics? Has it affected it at all, or have you deepened your relationship with any of your family members through it, would you say?
I think I've definitely deepened my relationship with family members. I think it wasn't easy. I mean, I've come from a family of writers. So my mum is a writer. She writes. She now writes Regency romance, but her whole career she was a biographer. So I grew up in a house of writers. My dad was a writer. He was a publisher. My brother has gone into. He's always been in publishing, and he's now an agent. So I'm really lucky in that I live, that it's just and I've always written. So, and I've always written from personal experience. So even when I wrote fiction, it was based on personal experience. So, there was no surprises. But I think you can never really prepare yourself for how it feels to have such a personal telling of your story out there in the world, and that it's not just my story. It inevitably merges with many other stories, people that I care for. So that aspect was really tricky, and it was sort of surprisingly tricky when the book came out. It wasn't difficult with my mum, because she was very much part of the process of writing the book. Like, I had multiple conversations with her. She read drafts of it as we went along. I was really reliant on a lot of her memories and, stories from before I was born and from when I was a child, and her relationship with my dad. And she was also very generous in allowing me to do what I needed to do. She did say to me after it was published that she would have found it more difficult, I think, if it hadn't have been such a beautifully written book. That sort of good prose, beautiful writing begs for forgiveness. That's a quote that I think it's Philip Lopate or someone who writes that, and I really believe that. I think if you create something beautiful and you really spend a lot of time and care on it, people will forgive you for that.
they can feel the kind of care and the intention that you put into it, perhaps, that you're
Exactly.
crafting it, that you're treating it with respect. It's not like a throwaway sensationalist sort of piece of writing.
Absolutely, and I think that that extends to the way that I wrote about my father as well, because I was exposing his sins, if you want to call it that, which I'm not religious, but that sort of taps into the title, um, and yet I kept hold of my love for him through the whole book, and I write him, I hope, and I've been told this, with a lot of compassion and understanding, and
With such a sympathetic portrayal, but showing kind of all of his great qualities. You go back to his childhood to make sense of kind of where so the question is how could it have ended like this, and then you kind of go back to look at the kind of psychological origins of him. It's really, really moving,
mm,
and yeah, that really does come across, your love for him,
yeah,
as well as it's the light and the dark, isn't it?
yeah. So, in answer to your question, I'd say that it has made the bonds stronger, but it was certainly certainly had difficult periods um, after publication, just of navigating the kind of complex feelings that came up amongst certain members of my family. And not everybody has read the book. People have chosen not to read it, and that's absolutely fine. There's no it's everybody has to know how they can handle it, and the other thing to think about is that the kind of the whole hype around publication is really big when it happens, and it can feel overwhelming, but it inevitably then dies down. It's only a few months that you're kind of doing events and talking about the book, and it seems to be everywhere. And after that, it just becomes another book on the bookshelf, and you move on. So
How did it feel to you when The Sins of My Father was published?
it
How
was
did you
I
feel?
I kind of went a bit mad, I think, for a few weeks. Just in the pre-publication, I think I was quite anxious about it, and then when it came out, I felt slightly dissociated. I did go slightly balmy for a bit. Um,
I
hi,
guess you're a character. It's like what you were saying, you're detached from it. It's your life, but then you are kind of almost like a character in a story as well. I can imagine that must have been a bit sort of
It
disorienting.
was a bit weird, yeah. And I think also that, it felt like it was a long time coming as well, because I had a novel published a long time ago, when in my sort of early 30s, and then I had a big patch where I was writing novels, but I wasn't managing to get them published. It was when my children were very young, and so I sort of had fallen off the publishing ladder for a bit. So when this book was picked up very quickly, and I mean, it took me a long time to write it, but there was a lot of hype around it, and I think that felt quite nerve-wracking as well, because there was a sort of expectation, I suppose. But it's all hype at the end of the day. I mean, it's wonderful to get published, but you are the kind of you're the exciting book and the exciting author for that period of time, and then inevitably someone else steps in your place, and that becomes quite a relief.
Step out of the limelight
Yeah.
for a bit.
Yeah.
That's an interesting kind of other layer where you mentioned that about how, kind of you weren't published for a few years when your children were little, because obviously I'm really obsessed with the whole idea of finding your voice, and you touch on that explicitly in Into Being. I was saying to you earlier, I was kind of furiously underlining bits, but also I suppose, the process of writing this book, you found your voice and you describe it, how when you finally found it, it was such a magical moment. But then also, I guess, in terms of, you're also, you refound your voice as a writer and sort of kind of public, um wide acclaim. That must have been quite a satisfying layer to it as well.
It was amazing, and I think also that was to do with finding a form of writing that sat comfortably with me as well, and I think I write about that in Into Being, that, because I was a journal writer all through my childhood. I started writing diaries when I was really young, and all through my teenage years, and, and then I naturally segued into novel writing because that's what everyone did in those days. I did an MA and novel was an option. There was not an option for memoir because it just wasn't really a thing, even though I was reading memoirs, but not really realizing that they were memoirs. Some of my favorite books were memoirs. But I didn't really think of them as memoirs. I thought of them as novels, which I think a lot of people do. A lot of people don't understand that differentiation. So I think when I started writing creative nonfiction, and actually it was Julia Bell who pointed this out when I was doing my PhD. She just said it sits more comfortably for you, that you're finding yourself more. You've got more power in this form of writing, and I think that we all have our superpower in our writing. In that, whether we're particularly good at writing fiction or nonfiction, and it sat more comfortably for me, I think, because of that past of journal writing. That I had always written about my feelings. It was important to tap into my wisdom, I used my journal writing as a form of self-soothing as well. And so to then sort of move into the more psychoanalytic sort of realm of writing memoir, and reflective memoir felt natural to me. So I think it was also finding that felt right. And then it felt right that was then recognized and appreciated.
So earlier you just kind of described your voice as perhaps kind of psychoanalytical as part of it. What do you think your voice is like, and how do you define voice as well?
Well, it's not really psychoanalytical because I'm not a trained psychoanalyst or therapist, but I suppose
very self-aware, and I was really struck by kind of, there's so much symbolism in your book and sort of Jungian sort of archetypes, and also I don't know, mythical references to Narcissus and Echo. Like I really loved that layer in your book.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was just I was in psychoanalysis. I did go to a Jungian a psychotherapist for a good sort of 2 or 3 years when I was going through a marriage separation, and that was very, very life-changing for me. It really helped me enormously to sort of understand myself better and understand the influence of my dad. And so all of that fed into the writing of the book. And I do say this to my students often, that actually I think a good therapist alongside writing a memoir can be hugely beneficial for you to find your voice, but also to be able to kind of, objectify and storify your life. Because there is something quite similar to the process, I think. So I think that definitely fed into my book. I was just very interested in all of that stuff when I was writing it, and I would go to the gym when I was redrafting my book. I'd go to the gym and listen to this Jungian Life, which is a podcast. I'd listen to it on my headphones.
Yeah, I know.
And so I'd sort of think, oh yeah, so I'll choose a certain topic, and then they'd be telling me all about and of course, because a lot of that refers to myths as well. That Jungian psychoanalysis is very into storytelling and myths. So I drew a lot of inspiration from that as well at that time. So I think it's just one of those wonderful things. It's when you're immersed in a subject, you kind of see it everywhere, don't you? There's so much opportunity to expand your knowledge about something, and I really enjoyed that.
Synchronicity, as Jung might say.
Yeah, synchronicity, exactly. Yeah.
So what do you think voice is? How do you define voice?
Well, I suppose your voice is your personality, really. I mean, it's part of, like, when you're meeting someone for the first time, that you get their personality through their mannerisms and their voice and what you see and what you hear. And writing is an extension of that, but it's just a different way of articulating the voice or the personality or the inner being. It's your inner being on the page. In memoir, I mean, obviously in fiction it's different because it's a contrived voice of a character. So there's a lot more space to model and manipulate that voice to be a character that you want to project in your story. But when it's memoir, it's essentially you or an aspect of you. I mean, Vivian Gornick, who's a brilliant writer, she wrote a book called The Situation and the Story, which is about memoir and personal narrative. And she talks about the persona. The personal narrator adopts a persona, which I suppose it's the medium between the person, the actual person, and the story. And I think that can be quite helpful because it's not actually you. It's who you choose to project to tell that story. And I think that thought can also be quite liberating for someone who's struggling over memoir and struggling over questions of exposure, because you can adapt your voice. You can adapt it, not as much as in fiction, but you can certainly. There is a performative aspect of it. If you're chasing a particular emotion or a particular sort of state, a particular message that you're trying to put across in a particular chapter, you can manipulate that voice to kind of display that emotion.
So do you think your next book, if say you were to, I hope you're going to write another memoir or explore a different topic, do you think your voice would be different then? Or do you think there's like a kind of an intrinsic quality, but then, as you say, the persona slightly changes? Do you imagine it would be a different approach next time?
A really good question to ask, because actually that makes me reflect on what I've just said about the persona, because I think there is that performative aspect, but you're also straddling a very fine line between authenticity and characterization, aren't you, when you're writing memoir? And I think what people respond to mostly is the inner voice. It's the inner. It's when you touch on that kind of inner nerve of being. And I write quite a lot on my Substack from that inner place. I have, often behind a paywall when it's that really much more kind of personal stuff. And it's quite interesting to see the reader's response to that when you write very unselfconsciously, and you kind of you go into that very sort of internal, deeper place in yourself. And
What's the difference between other writing that you've noticed? What have you observed from how they respond?
Well, I think I definitely tapped into that in Sins of My Father. I think that it has a lot of that inner writer in it. And I think, when you're crafting the book, I suppose you're just aware of where you want to have that sort of deep emotional impact. And then you might be drawing back, it's a sort of mixture, isn't it, of going into that very personal place and then drawing back and giving more of an overview or giving more exposition or more information.
I think it's truth.
The truth, yeah.
I think it's truth. Like I think people, you know, like you say in Into Being, I do think probably it is true that a reader can kind of sniff out when something's inauthentic or isn't kind of fully explored. And I think, yeah, what you're describing, essentially, maybe it boils down to just honesty and truth.
Honesty.
Do you think?
I think
That's
it is.
fair?
Yeah, I do. And I think it's much more immersive for the reader, actually. I think that they're very drawn into that. Whereas when you're not tapping into that, it can feel more surface and more superficial. And I think I hope that this is where we protect ourselves from AI, from from
Oh, that's an interesting.
Chat
Yeah.
GPT, coming in and saying, yeah, I can write a memoir. It's like, actually, you can't, because, you can't replicate that really profound depth of personal inquiry that memoir is so reliant on. And
It's an embodied experience as well. I think like AI isn't able to, it will only ever be a kind of a mirror of,
Mm.
yeah, sort of a mirror of a mirror. I don't think, because AI at the moment, I guess maybe robotics will improve in the future, but your writing is so kind of embodied and it feels like it's like truth. And I don't know how AI would be able to replicate that. What do you think?
Well, I really hope not. I hope they won't be able to replicate that. I think if they were to replicate it, they would be simply copying someone who had done that with their memoir, because also there's so much, there's so little predictability and regularity in the way that we recall memory. Memory is such a personal and nebulous thing that, it can't be replicated in terms of somebody can't copy a sort of formulaic memory recalling piece of work in the way that AI is, only copying what's already there. I mean, they can copy someone who's written a memoir, they can copy the memoir and replicate that. But I don't think that they could kind of write a new memoir based on what a memoir should look like, because it's such a personal journey. It's so particular to the person.
And it's the difference between memory and information, because I feel like, yes, we talk about computers and AI having like an amazing memory, but as you say, it's a different form of memory. Do you think you can write memoir without a good memory?
Yes, because you can write about the fault of your memory. I mean, I think that's what's wonderful about memoir, is that the reflective voice is reflecting on the tricky nature of memory. So, you could write a whole memory on the fact you've got no memory. So how do you go through the world with no memory? It would actually be a really interesting book.
You should write it. Is it true that you've kept every single scrap of paper you've ever written on? I remember reading that in one of your books.
Well, not every single scrap of paper, but I have kept an awful lot of scraps of paper. I've got shelves of my notebooks that have all these things stuffed in them. So yeah, I do have quite a lot of. I don't like throwing away any of my writing. I really treasure it. Because it's a little keyhole into my sort of psychological state 30 years ago, and I find that quite interesting.
It's really precious. I really sort of regret that I've gone through phases in my life when I've always like written, but I think I'm quite a private person and almost like didn't want to commit myself sort of to the page in that way, and I really kind of regret that now, because I think that, yeah, from how you describe it, there's so much. I mean, I do write a journal now actually, and it is helpful. But I guess you found that you've sort of understood yourself. It was kind of a form of self-soothing, you said, and also I imagine it must have been helpful in the process of writing Sins of My Father to be able to go back and just be transported. What was that process like of kind of delving back over, I mean, wads and wads of the mountains of paper? Was it daunting?
I didn't do it that much, actually. I just went back to my diaries for those teenage years because I needed to check on certain dates and also to get a sense of my voice then. But there's a project that I'm thinking about getting involved with next, which is Richard Beard. Richard Beard has is doing an online memoir project at the moment, which is called the Universal Turing Machine, which is basically a chessboard. He's written a memoir, which is 1,000 words per year of his life, which is on this software on the computer, which is a chessboard. So you can kind of click on various different years. And so the memories don't necessarily connect chronologically, but they form a unity, whichever way you decide to read the memoir. And he's doing it as a collaborative project, as a kind of defense against AI. And I'm thinking of maybe sort of getting involved with that. And I was thinking, okay, so how could I write a chronological memoir which would be solely about me, not about my father? And actually, then I realized that I've got all this material. I haven't got my diaries from when I was born, obviously. I've got it from kind of when I was 8 years old. So I do have that research. I have that to return to. So I could potentially do it, and just be reminded of different things, that happened different years. So I think that's quite a nice challenge to do. So yeah.
Yeah, that sounds brilliant. I really do hope that you do that. There's some really powerful moments in Sins of My Father that I think sort of really reveal the power of writing and reclaiming your voice, and therein the power of the written word. Actually, they kind of mirror the memoir writing process in a way, because one of them is when you write to the person who groomed you, who came on Facebook, and you tell him exactly what he did and to stay away. How did that feel?
Oh, it felt like a real closure, yeah. Yeah, 'cause he contacted me. I was actually on holiday with my mum down in Cornwall. I think it was, I don't know, quite a long time ago. It was probably like 15 years ago or so. And I got this message from him on via Facebook, and I hadn't had any contact with him since I was a teenager. And he said something about how he knew that I had written him into my novel. And it was just a sort of ego stroking kind of, like he was really sort of touched that I had written him into my novel. And then suggested, yeah, then suggested that we meet up for a coffee, and implied that he knew where I lived, because he mentioned my sort of local cafe. And I was so taken aback, and thankfully I was with my mum. I mean, it was just like all this sort of rush of emotion. And she just said, really cleanly, she just said, "Just reply to him and tell him that, you never wanna hear from him again." And I did, and yeah, and I named it. I think for the first time I named what had happened, and I said, "You groomed me, what you did was wrong, it was illegal, and if you ever contact me again, I'll go to the police." And yeah, it was just an amazing opportunity to kind of just absolutely put a stop to that. And we were, I mean, he knew about Sins of My Father, and he read it because I heard about it through other people. And and I could have had contact with him through that whole period, but I think because I had closed the door on him there and then, it just made it so much easier to not go back into that space again. So, yeah, it was very liberating.
There's so many kind of amazing scenes and moments. And the other one that I thought was so revealing, sort of your mum's character, and also the kind of difference between your father, never taking accountability. Oh, your emotions, that's your problem, kind of thing, nothing to do with me. And then you describe how after you see the antenatal teacher who your father had an affair with, who was a really close, almost sisterly sort of figure in your mother's life, I thought it was so remarkable that your mum then stepped up and basically said, I need to let her know that I know, so that this isn't visited on my daughter. I thought that was really powerful, and in that moment, she's also taking her power back.
Yeah.
What do you think about that whole?
Well, that was such a moment of synchronicity. I mean, that was just crazy, So there I was, pregnant with my first child, and living in Hackney, and this woman's name was presented to me as an NCT teacher. And all that history came flooding back, that, she had been a friend of my mum. She'd been my mum's NCT teacher when she was pregnant with me, and my dad had had an affair with her. And I was really upset by it. I was kind of surprised by my feelings, but I think for the first time I really felt my mum's vulnerability and what she must have felt at that time, being heavily pregnant with me. And I actually went to this woman's house because she had a screening of a film showing from her house, and my midwife was there. And I went into her house and met her for the first time since I was a child. And I was overwhelmed with sort of almost like this internal sort of panic. It was like a sort of post-traumatic stress sort of response. And I think my mum was just really taken aback by the power of that it still had an effect on me. And so she felt that by sending a letter to this woman, that she would be also protecting me, that she was again just putting a stop to it and saying, I know what happened. Because she hadn't had an opportunity to do that when it had happened all those years ago. So that felt really important, and it felt important for her, and it also felt important for me. I think my mum said, I think she said that she felt she needed to take the responsibility for that. She needed to take that away from me so I didn't have to hold it, which I thought was amazing, actually. So yeah, that was kind of between me and her, really, in a way. So yeah.
Lily, thank you so much. I mean, I could talk to you for ages, but I know that you've got so much going on at the moment, and with the book coming out next week. And I wish you all the best. I know it's going to be really, really well received. I absolutely loved it. I'm going to do some of the exercises for it as well throughout. But yeah, it was inspiring.
Well, thank you, Jessie.
I loved chatting to Lily about her process and experience of writing memoir. I found it really interesting that she came to a point of genuine detachment from her story. Rather than feeling exposed or vulnerable with it out in the world, she sees it as almost separate to her. It's as if the process of turning her story into art transmuted it and made it into an object that she could feel removed from. What also struck me was this idea of giving yourself permission to write your story, in spite of your fear, regardless of the consequences, regardless of how people in your life might react. Lily was careful to stress that it has to be a conscious choice, that you need to be sure of why you're doing it. Lily was clearly powered on by the need to tell her story and the belief that it was about something bigger than herself. Memoir's not something to be undertaken lightly, but the potential for transformation and connection is clearly huge. Thank you for listening to this episode of How You Find Your Voice. Please subscribe, like, and share with a friend. Till next time.